Hi, I wanted to talk to you about the specific literary analysis assignment that you're going to be writing for this class and try to answer some of these questions about the rhetorical situation that you're going to be writing in. So just know that you don't have to memorize all this information about your assignment because I'm going to be posting this on Blackboard later. So I did want to show you, though, just a preview of what your assignment is going to be for this literary analysis. So what I want you to do is to analyze either a short story or a poem. Earlier in the learning activity, it's mentioned that you can do a literary analysis of all different types of things. You could do a novel, you could do a film, you could do a song, but I don't really want you to do those other things for a couple of reasons. One, I think that it makes it a lot easier to do a good literary analysis if you choose something that's fairly short. So that's why I think a short story or a poem would be ideal. I would not recommend trying to do a literary analysis of a novel because, most novels are a couple hundred pages long. And for the scope of this essay, only 5 pages, I think it would be really hard to try to cram a couple hundred pages worth of material into a short essay like this. The other thing is, I always have people who want me to let them write a literary analysis about a song. I've tried allowing people to do that in the past, but the problem is that songs, especially a lot of them today, are just very repetitive and don't really offer the complex sort of interpretation that stories and poems do. And again, that's not all music. I know that there are exceptions to that. I've just never had a really good literary analysis done on a song. So please choose one of those couple of types of texts, okay? Short story or a poem. So for this essay, it's going to be 5 pages long. You just completed this evaluation that was 3. So while that may seem like kind of a big jump from 3 to 5, something to think about is that you'll have the benefit of including quotations from the text that you're analyzing, which is automatically going to help you to make the essay longer. So the key is, to get 5 pages, you're going to need to choose a short story or a poem that's interesting and complex enough that you can get 5 pages out of it. A lot of people make the mistake of choosing a poem that's really straightforward or a short story that really doesn't have that much going on in it. And the result is that students who do that usually have a really hard time filling 5 pages. So your topic choice from the beginning is going to be very important in allowing you to get to 5 pages. So I said here, write a 5-page literary analysis of a short story or poem that poses an interesting interpretive question. What I mean by that is a sign that it's a good text for you to analyze is one that leaves you with questions after reading it. It shouldn't be so obvious and straightforward that you're not wondering about anything. Good texts will leave you questioning. And the idea is for you to kind of focus on some question that's being raised in that text and try to answer it with your essay by looking closely at the evidence in the text itself. We'll kind of do an example together later. So if you're not clear on what I mean by that, I'll try to illustrate it later in this video. So I said here, choose something that poses an interesting interpretive question and offers an interpretive thesis. So again, any good academic essay probably is going to ask you to have a thesis at the end of your introduction. In this case, that thesis should explain what you think the work's message is, or its significance, or that analyzes its specific structure and features. So, focusing on a particular character or focusing on a symbol that appears in the text, or focusing on the setting, why the way it is, the way that it is, right? I say here, be sure that you focus on the text for your interpretation, and you do that by including quotations as your support. That's really key for any sort of analysis, because the idea is that if there's no specific quotes or any specific information like that, it's probably going to be getting to be close to a summary rather than analysis. An analysis means to look at something closely and break it down and look at its individual parts and how they add up to the overall meaning. So if you're not including that really specific textual information, probably not analyzing very well. So I kind of just included like the major things that I'm looking for. You're going to have a grading rubric like last time, where I go into like the specific areas of the essay that I'm really looking at. But essentially, like I mentioned a minute ago, I'm asking, do you have a thesis? And is it consistent from the beginning of the paper to the end? So in other words, at the beginning of the essay, you're telling me what you're trying to prove or what you are trying to say about the interpretation of this text, and that should remain the same throughout the whole essay. You know, a lot of times when we're writing, we'll think we're trying to prove one thing, but by the end of the essay, we've kind of moved in a different direction. That's normal, and that happens a lot when we write. But I think what you need to do is, once you've actually finished a draft of the essay, go back and look at your thesis and ask yourself, am I still proving this initial point that I said I was trying to? If not, you need to go and change that thesis. You don't have to scrap the whole paper. Just change that one sentence and make it match with what you're actually analyzing in the paper, okay? As far as support and examples, do you provide enough clear examples and details to illustrate the point of your essay? We're going to talk about why that's so important in a couple minutes here. The essay needs to be organized. Is there a method of organization for the essay? So, you know, whether that's chronological order, like explaining this text in the order that things actually happen in the text itself, or are you organizing by order of importance, like starting with the least convincing point and moving up to the most convincing point? It doesn't really matter what method you use as long as you're consistent about it. And again, going along with that, have you organized the examples in each paragraph in some sort of logical manner? So again, when somebody reads your essay, they shouldn't be wondering, why is this here? Or why did you talk about this here rather than over there, right? When you're causing your audience to question and get confused, you're not really meeting their expectations, right? And of course, I'm going to be looking at mechanical stuff, grammar, punctuation, spelling. Have you carefully proofread your paper for errors? You know, have you edited your paper, trying to fix those sentences that don't sound quite as clear as they could be? Again, this is mostly stuff that you would do before submitting the final version, right? So as far as the text that you choose, I want to make it really clear that as long as it's a poem or short story, I don't care what you choose to write about. But if you're stuck and you can't think of anything, you're not sure where to begin, I put a list here of some suggested popular poems or short stories, and I checked, and all of these things are ones that you can find the full text on Google. So through a quick Google search, you can find any of these short stories or poems. But don't think that you have to choose one of these, or that you even have to choose a poem or short story by a famous author. You know, if you find some poem or short story that you're really interested in, and you know, maybe it's just by a quote-unquote regular person, that's fine. The only thing I would say is, and people have asked me this before, am I allowed to analyze a poem that I've written myself or a short story I wrote myself? And the answer is no, because you already know what the meaning of that poem or short story is, right? The key for analyzing is to choose something where you don't know for sure what the overall meaning is. That's how that interpretation comes into play, where you're giving an educated guess based on the evidence that you have, okay? So like I said, this assignment sheet is going to be in the Learning Resources tab eventually in Blackboard, so stay tuned for that. So let me click out of this, and let's talk about the rhetorical situation for your literary analysis. So answering some of these questions raised earlier in the learning activity. As far as the purpose, the idea is to show that you've done a close reading of the text that you're analyzing. And again, you don't want to be talking about like pages worth of a short story all at once. You know, you want to give specific examples or talk about even specific words in that text rather than huge swaths of that text itself. Again, when you do that, it's probably closer to summarizing rather than analyzing and looking closely at the text. You also want to offer your own interpretation of the text's overall meaning and explain how the writer gives you that impression. So, you know, as far as that interpreting stuff, right? It's saying, based on what I see, here's what I think this writer's trying to say or do with this text. But also the how that I sort of emphasized here is, what is it in that text that gives you that impression? So if you have a particular idea in mind, what is it in the text that shows you that? Is it the imagery that's being used? Is it symbolism that the author is using? Is it some theme that keeps coming up over and over again? I think that how is sometimes harder to express, but that's something good to include in your thesis, I think. And then also, as far as purpose, you want to briefly discuss the context of the text if it's relevant. But mostly you want to be focusing on the text itself. So what I mean by that is, mostly you want to be looking specifically at this poem or short story. You should not be like doing outside research really to see what other people have said or interpreted about it. Again, I think it's okay to maybe look at those things, but that's stuff not to be included in your own analysis, right? This isn't a research paper. This is a close reading of a particular text, and the emphasis should be on your own specific interpretation. As far as context, though, what I mean by that is there any background information that we as the audience would need to know that would help us to understand your interpretation, right? And that context information might be like the time period, right? So if we know that a certain poem is written during World War II, and there's something about that text that has to do with the war, it might be important to know that that's the time period that it comes out of, right? Or if we know that the author of a text is a person of color and some theme of race comes into play in that text, it might be important to know that information. Again, those couple of things, like the time period, information about the author that's relevant, what's going on in the world at the time that this is being written. That stuff might be helpful and useful for the audience in helping to understand that interpretation that you've come up with. But it shouldn't dominate the paper too much. I think probably in most cases for a 5-page essay, maybe 1 paragraph, 2 at the most, would be all that I would devote to context. And again, if that contextual information is not really relevant, then it doesn't need to be included, right? If the text doesn't really have anything to do with gender, that mention of the author's gender doesn't need to be included.